Today's podcast is looking at the book of First Chronicles. Just like the book of First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, there's First and Second Chronicles, which were probably written as one volume each to start with. But since we're looking at the Bible, specifically right now, the Old Testament, in a chronological fashion, just following our conversation we had last week looking at First Samuel, this week we want to look at First Chronicles. And in First Chronicles, we really are looking at the reign of King David. And First Chronicles, or David's reign, was probably written by Ezra about the year 450 BCE. And if you're following along in my book, Deep and Wide, we are reading and discussing First Chronicles between March 3rd and March 8th, if you're choosing to use this as a daily devotional rather than just reading it in chunks. I actually wrote it as a book to be read in daily increments. However, when I was reading the final draft, I read it straight through and in chunks. Took me about a week, and I actually enjoyed it that way. I almost went through and took out all of the daily passages and made it just a study in chunks. But since I'd set it up that way, I kept it that way. Okay, so when we're looking at David's reign, some important things that we want to look at would be looking at the importance of genealogy. We find in many parts of the Old Testament where there has been a retelling or a recording of genealogical records, and that occurs here as well. We also come back in Micah and see that, and we do see some repetition. That's kind of good sometimes, because with repetition that supports other passages, builds up their credibility. We can see also where they talk about the one descendant of Jonathan. We see that because David had been one of the military leaders for King Saul, the people readily accepted him as their king. For the most part, there was a little scuffle there where some things weren't quite exactly right, but we'll talk about that more as we get into some of the other studies. While Samuel was the judge or the prophet, you might say, under King Saul in the beginning of David coming in, Nathan was the major prophet during the time of David's reign, and David went to Nathan and said, okay, here we have built this palace out of beautiful cedar wood here, and David was able to reign as king in the city of Jerusalem. He saw that, okay, but our Holy of Holies, our temple, is still in this tent dwelling, so to speak, that we move around. He says we need to have a full temple to worship God. It's not right that our church building, if you will, is built out of leftovers. Much of my life I've been very, very involved in every church I've been in. My father was a minister, so was my grandfather, and so you see some of the behind the scenes stuff when you work very closely with church leadership, or if your family was in full-time ministry. And it's interesting that, if a family in the church bought new living room furniture, the old stuff with rips and tears on it, oh, we'll give it to the church can use it. And many times you'd go through different rooms of the church and you see all this junk furniture and cast off stuff. It's like, we're not giving our best to the church sometimes. And now I can understand. It's like, oh, I hate to throw this away. It could be used in the teen room. But it's important that we don't have the best for ourselves, and then when we look at our churches, it's this will do sort of thing. And at the same time, our churches don't need to be so elaborate that the average person walking by would not be comfortable coming in. So There's some lessons to be learned there in Chronicles, looking at focusing on what it is that we give. Are we giving our best to the church? And I'm not just talking about material things and our money, but actually our time and our talents and things like that we give. Uh, I really liked when we get into around chapter 23 when David wanted to focus on music or worship. I almost think of King David as the one that began the frameworks for ministry of music, and that's very important to me because most of my personal worship comes through music. But as he started dividing up, um, uh, David found, this comes from First Chronicles 23, around verse 5. David found 38,000 men over the age of 30 from the tribe of Levi, who were the ones that were supposed to lead the people in worship. He divided them up as follows. 24,000 were to supervise the construction of the temple. 6,000 were judges and officials, 4,000 were guards, and 4,000 were musicians and music ministry. You know, David himself was a musician. David's son, Solomon, who would follow him as king, actually carried out David's plans for building the temple. When I recorded the content for the book of First Samuel, I made some statements that were not true about King David and his wives and children and things like that. And in the podcast, I did put the text across the screen of what was accurate based on what I'd said that was not. And here on page 136 and 137 of my book, Deep and Wide, I have the correct information for which I misspoke in my last podcast. So I want to read these two paragraphs, maybe three. David's first wife was the daughter of Saul. They never had any children. David's friendship with her brother Jonathan likely consumed his free time. David had 6 more wives before he restored Jerusalem, and each one of them bore him 1 son each. David had 4 sons with Bathsheba, his 8th wife, whom he took as his wife in Jerusalem. Now, any wives and mistresses that belonged to King Saul would have been passed to David as well. There's no evidence that he had any interest in them. I'm kind of the opinion that even though David had 8 wives, he truly loved 2 people, Jonathan and Bathsheba. There's a little discrepancy because when we study King David and his wives, you know, we see that he had um, uh, 6 wives with 1 son each, and then his 8th wife, he had 4 sons. But yet in other passages, we see he had 19 sons and 1 or more daughters. So I'm not sure where those came from. Perhaps the mistresses and wives of Saul that became his, if he was drunk one night or something. I don't know. I just don't understand. If I look at, you know, I can get all up in ires very quick when people start saying, well, biblical marriage, biblical marriage. In fact, I have a podcast. I haven't recorded the content yet, but probably it's going to come out in the same week as this, where I talk about all zebras live in the zoo. Well, we know all zebras don't live in the zoo, but we can say something as fact and say, this is what I believe. But if you believe something that's simply not true, then it's kind of silly. And so I'm going to kind of get into that a little bit. And if you're watching all my podcasts, you probably saw that 2 days ago already. I really have a problem when people want to have a conversation about biblical marriage. Okay, we're just looking at King David here. In the records, he had 8 wives. 1 wife he had no kids with. 6 wives he had 1 son each with. So there's 6 sons plus a daughter. So that's 7 children. And with Bathsheba, he had 4 sons. So that's 10. but later we see in the scripture where David had 19 sons. So yeah, if we're talking biblical marriage, I don't know, you might have your beliefs on marriage as how you think it should be, but there are actually facts about legal marriage, and they're not the same country to country. And there was time in the United States where it's not the same state to state. So you can have thoughts and feelings about how you want things to be, but you can't really say, I believe marriage is blah, 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 and I'm using biblical marriage, because actual biblical marriage is a nightmare trying to figure out all of these things here. So marriage really isn't something that you can say, well, biblically, marriage, no, because that what usually follows that conversation is a statement that is not in line with biblical marriage. And I will say that this mess here, just looking at King David with 19 children, but in the record, he had 10 children with his wives. So where did the other 9 come from? And then looking at and defining that as biblical marriage, hogwash. It's a waste of time to have conversation talking about biblical marriage, because nobody wants marriage like Old Testament biblical marriage is. So you don't really want biblical marriage unless your head's stuck in the sand or so far up your own hind parts that you don't really know what you're talking about. So David, son of Jesse, was king over Israel for 40 years. 7 of those years, he ruled from Hebron, which was part of the lands of Abraham, and the last 33 years in Jerusalem. There's a lot we don't know about David, and there are some speculations surrounding his relationships or lack thereof. His relationships with Jonathan and later Bathsheba will be discussed for generations to come. I'm reading from page 138 of my book in the devotional set aside for March 8th. There is a lot we do know about David. He was a man that was both strong and gentle. He was a man that was a good leader and yet repentant when he messed up. David was a man that was used and blessed of God, even in his human experiences and limitations, or even in his human failures. God uses us today. God can even use us after we mess up. God helps us move forward and beyond our failings. God sees the good in us and helps us with multiple fresh starts. So that's my important carry away from First Chronicles. God uses us today, and we can use our evidence for that because God used David even after he messed up. God can even use us after we mess up. God helps us move forward and beyond our failings. God sees the good in us and helps us with multiple fresh starts. If you've enjoyed this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.